At this point in Bartley's book, The Retreat to Commitment, he makes a small divergence back to where he began, which is an analysis of New Protestant thought. And he begins by noticing a kind of paradox at the heart of the enterprise. He goes on to say where it is obvious when you look at New Protestant thought that Protestants agree and cooperate today more than they ever really have before. And yet, at the same time, they disagree as well over issues that are considerably more fundamental than the ones that caused the predecessors to New Protestant thought to splinter into hundreds and hundreds of sects. He says that not even at the time of the Reformation has the Christian church differed so much on the issues that it considers most fundamental. He says that in the tradition that he sees and the one he grew up in, and particularly the new reform movement, which he is really focusing on here, that it is allowed and open. You can even ask questions and disagree about things like, does God even exist? And is there an afterlife? These questions are debated. And where something is being debated, it is being criticized. And if it's being criticized, then it is, even if the people criticizing it don't really believe it's going to happen, it is open to reform and change. And yet another paradox, another turn to this paradox, is what Bartley says, and he is quoting a number of other theologians here, one of which details his accounts with the students he's been speaking to. And this theologian goes on to say that anyone who knows the situation in our seminaries can testify that authoritarianism is gaining ground and that students simply want to be told. So on one side, the debate is there, it's being had and people are enjoying it, and it's open and criticism is running free. And on the other hand, there is a growing trend within the church as well, that people simply want to be told they've had enough of this. Even if they're allowed to criticize, they want someone to take a firm hand, they want an authoritarian structure. So a solution to this that comes around is very similar to the solution of, I suppose we can let the cat out of the bag here, of the critical rationalists, as Bartley sees it. The best one he sees is put forward by Karl Barth, who decides that if you must choose an irrationalism, then you ought to choose one that is as rational as possible, and one which appears to be excusable in terms of that problem that we began with, the problem of ultimate commitment and the limits of rationality. You can go ahead and say that any question about the Christian faith, about the Christian God and the Christian method, is itself revisable, and in principle revisable, of course. This is a tremendous flexibility, and it has a great element in ruling out future fundamentalism. And yet, at the other side, you do have to maintain at least something inflexible and beyond criticism and beyond change. Even if you think it's not there, even if you think everything is open for change, even if you think God is open for change, and every single message he has is open for change. Even that question of whether there's an afterlife is open. But there is an element here, at least in Barth's analysis, that the thing you must keep is the assent to Jesus. Now, what you mean by the assent to Jesus, again, can be open to criticism, but you must keep it. It has to be there. Now, we can have, like I said, long debates about what this means, what it properly means, what this presupposition actually ought to look like. But what you can't say is that such a presupposition shouldn't be there. So it sounds incredibly rational, and yet it is still making a very, very slight, and ever so slight, irrational commitment. And you can see it when it comes to the Protestant faith and the New Protestant Reform movement. Bartley's saying you ought to be able to see it too when it comes to critical rationalism. The New Protestant Reform movement here has, in some sense, unified the ideology and allowed free speech at all levels. It grows and strengthens the institution of Protestantism. It explains why there's been failures in the past, why there's been failures in the present and failures in the future, that perhaps we don't know enough and we ought to be able to find that out. And that's the enterprise before us, that we really must be rationalists. So what happens when a breakdown happens here? What happens when a breakdown occurs? A genuine failure of communication between two fundamental groups, or two ultimate commitments. Well, Bartley is pointing at something in here that I think Popper does in his work, and the myth of the framework particularly. Again, I'm not so sure who came up with this first, but there's a claim out there in the world that when you look at your opponents, when you're having an argument or a debate, and you see them in your own minds as lacking basic understanding, well, you can do so by at least claiming that it's because you have completely different ultimate commitments, and that genuine communication between those ultimate commitments is impossible. That irrationalism is not always a problem if what you're trying to do is change someone's mind. You can often talk people out of their irrationalism. But if they have a kind of irrational faith that puts a stop on this, or an irrational belief that is in so far contradiction to yours that you don't get a starting point, then, how do you begin? How do you end? How do you make any sort of progress here? And of course, in some ways, we're all bound by our irrationality and our lack of understanding. I mean, the whole Protestant tradition here is a fairly hopeful enterprise in some sense. It's trying to understand the world and the individual, all being done by individuals who are profoundly confused about themselves and about the world. And yet this is, for Bartley, the mistake that's being made as well in some sense. That there's an attempt often being made, which is to save God and save the faith. There's often a claim being made that when you killed God, in Nietzsche's words, that you're left with confusion and alienation. Now, Nietzsche thought that this would happen too, of course, and maybe it is true, and maybe it is true for some people and not for others. But if the death of God breeds confusion, then the saving of God at all costs also breeds confusion, because you're willing to turn God into anything, and the faith into anything, simply so that it survives, because that is your irrational commitment. And here he sees the Protestants have sown the seeds of their own failure in some ways, so desperate to save their faith that they can't see what they're doing to their own faith. They can't see what they've done to the identity that they claim. Now, this is where Bartley gets into some really deep details about Christianity. And he speaks to a lot of people inside the community. And he says communication, or that breakdown of communication, has happened so profoundly within Christianity today that the people at the top of the faith, top of the hierarchy, so to speak, the people in charge, the people who are teaching the faith and preaching the faith, are incredibly disconnected from the people who actually sit in the pews and listen. They contradict each other, both groups. They no longer agree on important issues. They simply have passwords, as Bartley calls them. A few key phrases that you throw out from time to time, like a shibboleth, simply to say we're on the same team. Once you hear the phrase, you hear it, and it makes sense to you that this person is connected to you, and you're speaking the same language. But the rest of what is said is completely alien to you. And this grows to such a belief that Bartley goes on to say that many in the clergy are incredibly tentative simply to communicate their beliefs at all to their believers, to the community and to the churches, that people that come each week. And the churches then turn into these pantomime events where not much has ever been said, and it's been filled in with song and dance and all sorts of events that are not Christian. He uses a fairly derogatory phrase here where he says, when someone says to me, I'm a Christian, they might as well be saying, I go dancing. So is there communication between these two groups? If people know at least that basic shibboleth, the few basic phrases that you have to repeat, and you carry them out with a few basic actions that you know you're meant to repeat, even if the rest of it is being lost and the rest of it is not really being properly communicated, is there communication happening here? Can they communicate? I mean, they're obviously cooperating in some ways. For Bartley, proper communication with someone, or with anything, involves more than just the words. It means something else. It's an appreciation of what the person really believes underneath it all, or what they mean by what they're saying. When a Christian says, I believe in God, you should know exactly what that means. If you're another Christian, you're hearing those words. It shouldn't be open for interpretation. You shouldn't have to ask questions about the person and think, well, what exactly do they mean by this? It could be anything. It could be the phrase, Jesus Christ is Lord. Sure, no one has direct access to another's mind, but we can conjecture, and we can then criticize those conjectures. And we would hope, if we were part of this new Protestant faith, that those conjectures are more often right than wrong, and the criticism that we do and apply to it doesn't get us anywhere, or only gets us to an improved understanding, rather than a wider gulf. Some of the issue in this is simply got to do with language, and the particular type of language that we use. It can become so debased in some senses, so ambiguous, that it is almost impossible to know exactly what you are agreeing upon with someone or disagreeing with. Like that phrase, I believe in God. It gets thrown around in so many different contexts that you simply may not have an understanding of what it means anymore. And when you hear someone say it to you, you have no idea what they're talking about. And it certainly stands to reason that if we are talking about communication here and we care about communication and we look at people who are trying to understand each other, well, they simply have no way of doing this if they also have no way of determining just when they are in disagreement with each other and when they are in agreement. Now, Bartley goes into some detail here about language theory, which I will do my best not to go into detail with. I don't think it's particularly prescient for the rest of the book, and it will bore the hell out of all of you. But he runs through some of the basics here, which is to look at communication as something that serves a function, or to express emotions of the speaker, or as communication to signal or stimulate a release function, something within the hearer itself, or it could have a descriptive function, into the sense that communication describes a state of affairs in the world. And you can express things without signaling anything. You can express or signal without describing things. But you cannot signal without expressing, nor describe without expressing and signaling. And rather than get in those three types of language and the details of it, perhaps an analogy to art helps here. So you could have a work of art, and that work of art may go on to express a certain subjective state, something in the mind, something in the intention of the artist. And then those who receive the art or look at it may actually have no way to understand or decode exactly what that original sender, the original artist, did have in mind. But something is still being communicated here. The art itself is communication. Just what is being lost is the communication from sender to receiver, the specifics. But something else is definitely there. So to go back to his three modes of language here, you may not, as the receiver of that particular piece of art, actually receive the express function of the art, which is the emotions of the person who done it, the artists themselves. In which case, the signaling will also be lost. If you can't understand what the artist was trying to communicate, then any signals they were trying to send you will always also be gone. Though you may be able to still extract some descriptive function from the art. It might be possible to express something without actually signaling anything. Express how you feel, for example, through a piece of work without trying to signal anything in particular or stimulate some other function in the person you're trying to send the art to. You may also be able to express and signal without describing anything. So you express something through your art, you also signal an emotional response, a function in the person next to you, who you're sending the art to. And yet the communication does not really describe any state of affairs. So the descriptive function is lost. But what you can't do is send a signal to someone, to signal through your art, without also expressing yourself through your art, to show that emotional beginning. You also can't describe without both also expressing and signaling. The descriptive function, the communication function, if that's what you're going for, and that's what you're trying to achieve, it must have both the expressive function, which is the expression of the artists themselves within the art, and what they're hoping to achieve, as well as the signaling function, and what you're deliberately trying to communicate or stimulate within the person reading or viewing your art. If what you want is communication, then you need to understand, or at least those two things have to be properly communicated. Which is why you can have a piece of work which is trying to express a certain subjective state or the mind or intentions of the artist, as I mentioned before. And yet the people receiving the art may not be able to decode it at all, at least not in what was intended by the original sender of the art. Now, when we bring us back to religion and to Protestant thought, it can't be real, it can't really be doubted that religious discourse was intended to be descriptive and explanatory, as well as, in some sense, expressive and stimulative. It wants to describe the world, and therefore it needs those first two functions. It needs to express something, and it needs to stimulate within the person receiving the art that particular message, that release function. And that remains true. So you do need to know an awful lot more than simply a catchphrase. Communication runs much deeper than this, or at least accurate communication does. Bartley has a phrase here. He says, logic has a way of avenging herself on those who treat her lightly. And he goes on to say that if you were to abandon logic, well, then you lose the power of argument itself and of consistency. Because in some sense we are critical rationalists here. Well, at least Bartley is. And for argument itself, what you're hoping to show is that the two claims are incompatible, that you have a problem, you have an error, and you've discovered it. And yet, if we go on to abandon logic, then we abandon an awful lot more than what you think you are when you make that step. You also diminish, in Bartley's own words here, the enormity of our powers of description. Because if you were to, for example, say what something is, to describe the world in some ways, or an object within it, you are at the same time saying an awful lot about what the object is also not. You can't say, for example, what a cup is, without also saying, even if they're not being explicit in this, a tremendous amount of things that the cup simply cannot be, and is not in the world. And yet, if you go on to then allow contradictions into your logic, and we permit these, then you can say anything you like about the cup. Everything is permitted, because the way that we don't permit things is through contradictions in logic, errors. And you've already decided you're allowed to have them. By breaking down in this way, we don't just lose the power to argue, we use the power to describe the world at all. We are only left with those other powers of communication, which are to express and to signal, and not to describe the world. Now, Bartley says this may be sufficient in some ways, if you're trying to do poetry, for example. It may even work for music. But if you dig deep enough, do they really work for something like religion? Do they simply debase it in a way that takes away all that it actually is, or ought to have been? And Bartley thinks that theologians and Christians, when they defend in their faith, and Bartley does have a lot of respect for the faith, despite the fact not being in it anymore, he wishes that they would keep these considerations in mind, because if you're losing the ability to describe your faith and the world around you, then you're losing an awful lot more. You're losing your integrity. You're losing your identity. And these might be cures of a kind that people see. These are ways to avoid challenging issues. But these cures may be worse than the disease themselves. And as Bartley goes on to say, these cures are in fact infectious. It's worse than simply that they debase the religion. They do an awful lot more than you don't actually see. They're destructive to the religious discourse. The ambiguities that we have in language, Bartley says, yeah, they are tremendous gifts to us, but they're also tremendous dangers, just as logic is. And it really matters how we use them. Bartley is imagining a scenario here, and there are obvious allusions he's making back to rationalists and critical rationalists here. But he is putting forward a story here. So imagine this. There's a prospective clergyman, and the bishop stands before them and asks him an obvious question, do you believe in God? Meaning, at least in the bishop's mind, something like, do you believe that it is a true statement that the God of the Bible, in that tradition, exists? And the candidate before him, the prospective clergyman, may be an atheist, or perhaps even a New Age version of what clergy is these days. Some sort of pantheist, for example, who takes the question and focuses on words such as believe in, and answers, yes, I do believe in God. There's a verbal agreement that has been reached here. It's undeniable. The candidate will pass through and become a clergyman. And you can then ask questions, if you were looking from this from a God's eye view, of whether the candidate really has been open and truthful in the response. But also, what was the point in holding the interview itself, you may ask? The person being interviewed wants to become a clergyman. And he wants to become the clergyman of a faith that has already decided that contradictions are acceptable. So is he really out of line with theological tradition or not? The way language spreads, that Bartley's fearful of here, and the dangers of language, which are the dangers of logic itself, is when people say, well, what's the problem in this? What's the harm? Why bother? Is a kind of cooperation happening here. And even if we don't have communication, then really what's being lost? Well, both men in this situation, as well as everyone else within the church who is aware of this kind of contradiction, or at least accepting of this kind of contradiction, is playing a kind of double life, a double role. If you think of that particular clergyman, he exists in an incredibly strained position within his faith. He must know that he interprets it differently to the rest. And maybe he may think something like the rest all interpret it differently to each other. But then what is the point of being a clergyman then? What is the point of the faith itself if every contradiction is allowed? Bartley says that and I'm not sure if this was a new phenomena at the time, it certainly seems to have come since, which is a high incidence of nervous breakdowns among the clergy. And he thinks that this is some of the issues here. To round off this particularly small chapter, Bartley has a quote from Thomas Vernon, who was a former congressional and then changed to a Unitarian minister. And this minister spent a lot of time challenging and dealing with the issues of good faith and good conscience within the faith itself. At one point, Vernon is asked what ought to be done about this particular challenge within the faith, this idea that we're allowed to have our contradictions and this diluting or debasing of Protestantism itself. And his answer, Bartley says it is a sorrowful answer when you look at Vernon at the time. But his answer is, let's just pretend. Now, I don't think a lot of people are picking up this podcast to hear about Christianity. But I think a lot of people are picking up this podcast and listening because they want to hear about rationality and critical rationalism and Karl Popper. And if it's not good enough for the Christian faith to say, and you recognize this as not being good enough to say, let's just pretend and accept our contradictions, then why on earth would it be okay for the critical rationalist to say, let's just pretend that we are rationalists, let's just pretend that there really is no contradiction, that we are living up, we have no crisis of integrity here. Because if you allow those contradictions to continue, as Bartley says, well, you don't know how far this will go and the impacts of it. If you allow a contradiction, you allow all contradictions. And what did this say for rationalism, if that's what we allow? Now, you can do what the Protestant faith has done in Bartley's eyes here, which is pretend that it's not going to become a problem, that we can just continue on anyway. Bartley doesn't think we should. And logically, he doesn't think that we should. And I think he's got a pretty good point. He's onto something.